I'm Ben Ryman, and this is Behavior Speak. In this conversation, Dr. Myles Durkee explores the concept of code switching, its implications in professional settings, the unique challenges faced by Black professionals, particularly Black women. He shares insights from his dissertation on racial microaggressions and the concepts of being white, exploring how these experiences affect young adults. The discussion also touches on the impacts of CGI policies on research, the intersectionality of identities, and the experiences of Black psychology. Dr. Durkee emphasizes the need for open conversations about this, especially for younger generations, and highlights the potential for a future where code switching is a voluntary practice rather than a necessity. Welcome to Behavior Speak, Myles.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, stoked. Before we get started, I want to acknowledge I am producing this podcast on the territories of the Kalami, Plains, Somoko, and Comox First Nations. Always grateful to be here. So, Myles, tell me a little bit about yourself.
Okay, so my name is Professor Myles Durkee. I'm an associate professor of psychology at the University of Michigan. I am a Los Angeles native, born and raised in Pasadena, California specifically, which is a suburb right outside of downtown LA. Attended college at Pomona College, where I got a bachelor's degree in psychology, and then got my PhD in educational psychology and applied developmental science from the University of Virginia. I also did my first postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Chicago, and then did a second postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Michigan, and then that position turned into a tenure track position. And happy to admit I was recently tenured as an associate professor about a month ago at the University.
Congratulations. That's awesome.
Thank you.
Yeah, so what stoked your passion to get into psych?
Yeah, so I mean, psych is the study of humans, human behavior, and the human mind. So I like to say that our psychology courses are some of the funnest courses you'll hopefully take in college, because everything we study, each student, each person in the class can relate to the material immediately because it's the study of us, So psych is such a massive field. You're talking about, the study of human beings, human behaviors, and the mind. So there's so many different avenues within psych to go into. So I was immediately drawn to the more social aspects of psychology and the more group dynamics of psychology, and really just the dynamics of culture, race, and identity were really the topics that piqued my interest the most. All the way back to my first intro psych course when I was, 18, 19, really piqued my interest. And then, continue to pursue those interests. I finished college at, the beginning of the previous, Great Recession. So there were pretty much no jobs to be had. So that was a great motivation for me to try to stay in school as long as I possibly could. And that's where, the PhD presented a great option. And, I'm one of those nerds that love grad school. So even after that, I decided to do a postdoc to get more training and research experience. And then that led to a second postdoc, which then kept me in academia. So I've kind of been in school my entire life and never actually left.
Yeah, well, and what made you go sort of the educational psych route?
Yeah, so Ed Psych, it was really my advisor. So I had the privilege to work with Dr. Joanna Lee Williams at the University of Virginia. And she was trained as a developmental psychologist. So the work she was doing kind of tied within race, culture, identity in education settings, looking with youth, how youth are coming into their own sense of racial identity and how they're experiencing different types of racial stressors and just informing the understanding of what race means to them. So the work she was doing fit very much with my interest. And then she happened to be in an ed psych program. So it was great because given my work, it fits much more closely with social psychology is where a lot of that work is being done. So it was great to be trained in the ed psych program, to have that applied aspect. And we started our work all within school settings. So first at the university level, then we went to high schools, then with middle schools. So it's great to actually, study these racial dynamics and identity experiences with youth as they're actually going through it in real time.
Wow. And so what were kind of some of the things you were learning then in sort of your dissertation projects?
Yeah, so the very first project I worked on when I first started grad school was it was a qualitative project looking at how emerging adults, so between the ages of 18 to 22, were understanding racial microaggressions. So we wanted to know which microaggressions do they notice, which ones are on their radar, and what are the most common types of microaggressions they're encountering. So we recruited students from four-year universities, from community colleges, and even community samples to really understand amongst this age group of 18 to 22-year-olds across different settings, how are they experiencing these racial dynamics in their day-to-day lives. And what shocked us the most from that study is that although we were just talking about them about the most common types of racial stressors they encountered, in every single focus group we conducted, as soon as one person brought up within race dynamics of someone within their race, kind of stressing them out and kind of
Mm,
targeting them for not being Black enough or
mm,
not an authentic member of the group or not fitting all the stereotypes of the group, each time that came up in every single focus group, it dominated the rest of the interview. So
mm,
the fact that I ran, I mean, I don't know, we ran over a dozen focus groups. I ran the majority of them. So at that point, I was kind of waiting for it. Even though we never prompted them to talk about within race dynamics, it came up every single time. And once it did, that just dominated the conversation. And from those focus group interviews, I realized that amongst this population of young adults, they really didn't have a space or opportunity to talk about within group dynamics when it comes to racial
mhm,
stressors. They were only used to talking about racism from an outgroup member, most often a white perpetrator of racism in the United States as a
mhm.
predominantly white country. But they didn't really have opportunity to even internalize or cope when that perpetrator could be a member of their own racial group, also
Yeah.
racially discriminating against them. So that led to the basis of my dissertation. And the most common experience that came up amongst the sample was being accused of acting white. So these were all Black young adults, but whenever they didn't fit that prototypical script of what a Black person is stereotypically expected to sound like, look like, behave, the types of interests they're in, such as their music interests, movie
Mhm.
interests, hobbies, if they didn't fit that very stereotypical script, then they were left vulnerable to be accused of acting white, which is the
Mm.
default. If you're not authentically Black, then you're acting white. So I could just see in these interviews the type of stress that it was causing these individuals because they were still trying to make
Yeah.
sense of it, of what does that mean? Should I be, acting more stereotypically Black or should I continue to
Mm.
act the way that feels natural? What should I do? Should I call out the perpetrator and basically call out them for, perpetrating stereotypes? Like they just really
Yeah.
weren't sure how to process this information. So
Yeah.
that's where I kind of got the idea for my dissertation, which all focused on this acting white accusation, but we looked at it much more quantitatively to look at what are the psychological consequences in relation to depressive symptoms, anxiety symptoms, and stress. And also wanted to know how does it then influence their own racial identity development? If someone is
Mm.
telling you you're not the right type of member of your group, how does that
Yeah.
influence the way that you then identify with the group?
Yeah. I did an interview with a behavior analyst. Her name's Dr. Danielle Judy, and her dissertation work was on colorism, and which was fascinating. I really hadn't sort of thought about kind of racism in that context, and colorism being such a more kind of a measurable, sort of objective sort of piece where you can see versus kind of racism is sometimes harder to sort of conceptualize because it's more of that social construct, and but she was talking a lot about how folks kind of grow up in sometimes being raised to potentially be more white, whether it be parents because of sort of this belief that if you're more towards whiteness, there's more privilege and so on, and everything from more extreme cases of bleaching skin and sort of those sorts of approaches to parents just not letting their kids go outside and making them wear hoods and lots of sunscreen, when during the day in hopes that they kind of get to lighter skin. And so is there sort of is there a connection there between sort of do you have a certification with the International Behavior Analysis Organization, the Qualified Applied Behavior Analysis Credentialing Board, the Behavior Analyst Certification Board, or are certified through your region's Behavior Analyst Credentialing Board? You can earn continuing education units for this episode by going to www.behaviorspeak.com and clicking on CEUs. The first secret word is survival. Some of this sort of belief from some families, and I understand that it's all stems out of racism initially,
Mhm.
back in the day, sort of families, and generationally pushing folks towards whiteness. And then you've got folks internally accusing each other of acting white. Is there a connection there at all?
Yeah, definitely connection. I mean, it's definitely a complicated multi-layer
Yeah,
connection.
yeah.
So with the aspect of colorism, particularly when we think about individuals who are multiracial or multicultural, in that sense, particularly if one of their identities is black, all right? But if they have a somewhat ambiguous look or phenotypical appearance where it's not really clear to decipher, okay, are they
Mm,
100% black? Are they mixed? Are they, what
mm,
are they? Then
mhm,
for these individuals particularly, they face much increased pressure to have to prove their blackness to other folks. So in this case, their behaviors can be policed a lot more
mm,
severely than other folks to kind of remind
mhm,
everyone to prove that they're still an authentic member of the group and to
mm.
kind of to demonstrate their solidarity and that they're, down for the group as well.
Yeah, yeah,
But along those lines, I want to emphasize too that even across the colorism spectrum, kind of in terms of this cultural policing, it happens across the board. So
yeah,
even if you're, phenotypically you do fit the prototypical look, your
right.
behaviors are still going to be policed. Let's say, you prefer Taylor Swift over Beyonce. Then in that case, people are like, whoa, wait a minute, that's the queen.
Yeah.
So all of these kind of preferences, or if you prefer, skateboarding over playing basketball,
Right.
these types of interests, they've been racialized in, Western society. So every single type of attribute or interest that you have, it has a racial script behind it. And if you're not choosing the right decisions, regardless of what your phenotype is, you can still be called out and ostracized and kind of teased or mocked in that way.
So what were some of the effects you kind of found on these kids that were being accused of acting white, and how did that affect their lives?
Yeah, so one of the interesting effects we found out is just that how young these experiences start. So in the data we collected with several hundred college students, having them think back to when these experiences first happened, for many individuals, these experiences started in elementary school, as young as like 9 years old, when people started calling them out like, hey, that choice you made is not really black. That's not black enough. You're not an authentic member of the group. And then developmentally, we see these types of accusations start to increase, as they get older, and they really peak around high school. So
Mm,
high school is really the peak when individuals encounter these. And then in college, so what happens in college is you have a kind of self-selection factor because you have to apply to colleges, you have to get admitted. In colleges, every college has a culture and kind of like a culture of the type of students they attract. Okay.
mm,
So you have this self selection kind of weeding factor with colleges. So because of that, and the colleges that students feel most comfortable choosing to go to, we see these experiences happen less frequently once they get into college. But the
mm,
interesting part is that once they do get to college, these are now oftentimes people who themselves have been victimized by these accusations. So they know how to use it. And they know how to use it strategically to kind of hurt someone else. So
mm.
sometimes it's if someone else is to come across as very cocky or you just want to insult someone to kind of, mess up their day, you
Yeah.
know how to cut them in a way that, and we find that too from the data too as well, longitudinally and quantitatively, that when these accusations come from in-group members, so racial in-group members of your same racial identity, they actually have much more severe lingering effects for your depressive symptoms and anxiety symptoms compared to when these same accusations come from an out-group member or a majority group member.
And so is that something that's happening then, that like is sort of these out group members? So these would be potentially white folks,
Yes, yeah.
and are white folks accusing black folks of acting white?
Yes, they absolutely are. So that also surprises as well with the data. So the way that we see this come out most oftenly is that when it's perpetrated by a white individual accusing a person
Mm-hmm.
of color, where that person of color is black or Latino in our data sets,
Mm.
it either comes across as a joke.
Yeah.
So it's an insult masked in humor, like, oh,
Right.
Jamal, you ain't really that black anyway. So,
Yeah.
you can hang out with us, you're not one of the other ones,
Right.
you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's either that way or it comes across the way of a double-sided compliment. Like, "Oh,
Mm.
you're an exception from these negative stereotypes. So, oh, you're so articulate. You're
Right.
more like normal, like me, like white people, you know? You're not like the rest of your group." So, in that case, then the perpetrators don't even know that they're insulting that person, where at the same time they're demonstrating that they actually believe this negative stereotype about their racial group, but they're complimenting this individual for not fitting that negative stereotype about their group, rather than challenging the stereotype in itself, the fact that they have evidence that does not confirm that stereotype. So it's just a way for this way the individual to reinforce that stereotype, even though the
Mm-hmm.
evidence in front of them is contradicting that stereotype.
Mm.
But they do this by complimenting the person for being an exception to the rule.
Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah. And so it seems like kind of like within group, it seems to be a lot more direct. You're acting white, and without and sort of outside of the group, it's sort of this indirect sort of side move. You're exceptional, so
Hmm.
you're like me, so you're more white because you're able to achieve things that only white folks could achieve.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly right. And two, when it's coming from a white perpetrator, so much time is coming to the way that, oh, you're just normal. Because in Western society, whiteness is seen as the norm for everyone. So that's also the way that it's perpetrated quite often.
And have you done any work, or have others done work to sort of look at this from the angle of the perpetrator?
Yes. So we have collected some data looking at from the angle of the perpetrator. So we do know cross-sectionally that perpetrators who are also having kind of mental health, or they're having challenges with mental health. So those who are expressing more depressive symptoms, anxiety symptoms, at the
Mm-hmm.
same time point, they are more likely to perpetrate these accusations against other members of the racial group. We're not seeing that effect linger over time. So we're talking about over years, multiple years at a time. We don't see these longitudinal lingering effects, but we do find them cross-sectionally. So if someone else is kind of going through their own personal trials or tribulations or having a really bad day, we do find that that can serve as a basis for them now to perpetrate against other individuals.
And is sort of the idea of acting white even a thing, really, though? Like, or is it just that there are these behaviors that Black folks are engaging in that we typically associate with the white group, like you said, like the bowling versus basketball or whatever. And so we're saying that's acting white as if white folks own those behaviors. Is there actually sort of a construct of acting white that exists, or is this just sort of folks framing stuff in, to sort of, deal with their own issues and sort of move
Yeah.
away from their own mental health problems?
Yeah, great question. So to answer your question just directly, so no. The short answer is no,
Yeah.
but it is complicated, okay? Because there's no one way to act like any racial group because every racial group is so heterogeneous, so
Yes.
diverse. Not every white person has the same exact interests, acts the
Mm-hmm.
same way. Not every Black person, not every Hispanic, Latino, Asian, Native American. So all we're doing is operating off of stereotypes right now. So this is where it's really societal stereotypes that are driving these effects. So we do know that in Western society, the group that's in the majority, the dominant group in most contexts, oftentimes one of the benefits that comes with being the majority of the dominant group is that you have much more influence on what's set as the standard and the norms. So usually
Mm,
these standards and these norms are now modeled off the dominant group because this is the
right.
group who's in power to says even so in my later work we now look at professional context. So when you're in your professional work context, every company has a set of professional work standards. So if we look across Fortune 500 companies and go back in history, we have to think about who was in the room at the time to set these professional workplace standards in terms of
Mm,
your appearance, how you carry yourself, what's proper work etiquette. So we all know who was in that room.
mm-hmm,
So it wasn't a
mm-hmm.
very diverse room, on
Yeah,
these
yeah,
corporate boards if we go back several decades. So
yeah.
in that case, then many of these, what's considered as professional etiquette, professional standards, it's modeled off the norms and preferences of the dominant group in hand. But so when other individuals demonstrate these same exact behaviors, then we kind of associate that as, oh, they're acting white, okay? Because in their case, then, because they're not part of that group who set these norms and standards, and the fact that they're not behaving in a way that fits the stereotypes of their group, now, in that case, rather than challenging, these stereotypes in the first place, we rather than label that person as acting white, rather than saying that, hey, there's no one way to act like any one
Right.
racial group. But we should consider too, when we think about what's considered as the norm, who are these norms really modeled after? So it's just instead of really challenging these social norms, instead it's easier. And I would say in the way we're socialized now, it's just more easier to now
Right.
call that person out for being an exception or kind of breaking a social norm or social rule.
So are you saying that sort of, because within group we're kind of talking about internalized racism here, right? And we're
Yes.
talking about, and so when Black folks are saying to other Black folks you're acting too white and you're not acting Black enough, acting Black enough is based on stereotypes that were set by the white folks.
Yes.
And so these weren't even sort of, so what these Black folks think acting Black means, think acting like the group they're in should mean, is really just a product of this sort of generational racism effect from white folks kind of putting that on them.
hmm Yeah, absolutely. But then that's where it becomes a slippery slope because at one
Mm,
point within your own group dynamics, you have to still show that same group solidarity, all right, to be an accepted, welcome member into, especially into a minoritized and marginalized group. There's a lot of interest in protecting those group
mm,
dynamics.
mm,
Kind of their safety in numbers, and we need to protect our group identity, given that it's been attacked so many ways and stigmatized and marginalized. So there's automatically a group dynamic and social pressure there, all right. So when it comes to these kind of social scripts, yes, at some point you need to show to the group that yes, I'm an authentic member of the group. And sometimes that can be confirming what are these stereotypes. But at the same time, you can't be too stereotypical because then that'll embarrass the group, especially if our societal stereotypes are negative. All right. So we can't have you
Mm-mm.
being way too stereotypical because now it's going to make the group look bad. So
Yeah,
you have to have
yeah.
this fine balance of being just black enough, but not too black. All right. Does that
Mm.
make sense?
It
So
does,
it's like,
yeah.
it's this fine line of kind of navigating these racial politics. And that's why when we were sampling these college students, they were really struggling with this, where they're like, because they're really coming into their sense of identity for the first time of being away from their family and their parents socializing them of how they should behave and carry themselves. Now they're on their own for the first time in college, living on campus. And they were having a really difficult time understanding, okay, what does authentic blackness mean to me? Like, how should I try to assimilate to the white majority at this university? Or should I try to, associate more with my own race? And then how black should I be? How white should I be? Should I be a combination of both? So that kind of led into my future line of research, which is that racial code switching, which
Mm.
is how people now adapt their racial behaviors and appearances and beliefs to now fit across multiple different contexts.
Yeah, I want to come to that, but I think this white accusation piece is a great sort of background and foundation for the code switching conversation. It seems like there's sort of this sort of, it seems like the acting white accusations seem to start, as you said, they start kind of in elementary school and go all the way through, and then they start to kind of get muddled a bit in college as folks kind of become kind of more independent, and then I'm guessing once they get into the professional world, which is often going to be working in contexts that are predominantly white,
Hmm.
things shift from acting too white to needing to act more white in order to kind of fit in, and this is where the code
Hmm.
switching comes. I'm curious about you're at the University of Michigan. I'm presuming a lot of your work was done there, and maybe at a couple of universities where you did your postdocs. Were you able to sort of see any data comparing sort of how folks were acting in sort of these predominantly white institutions versus the HBCUs?
Great question. Yeah. So that was actually the basis of my dissertation.
Hmm.
So I wasn't
Perfect.
able to publish the data from the HBCU for
Hmm.
political reasons.
Yep.
But yeah, so the data collection for my dissertation did look at a predominantly white university context of how these experiences happen, and then at a historically black university as well.
Hmm.
So from the data, I can speak to it, even though I can't publish it, I can speak to it. The dynamics shift drastically. Okay. And the reason they shift is because when your group is in the racial minority, there's much more at stake now to have to represent your racial group appropriately. Okay. So let's say at many of these, like at U of M, for example, when I first arrived here, our undergraduate population of black students was only 4%. So 4% of the university population. So severe minority. Now we fortunately got that above 5%. Still have a long
Hmm.
way to go, but we're at 5% now.
Yeah.
So you can imagine if you're only 5% of the campus, in most of your classes, you're going to be the only person from your racial group in that class. And every other member of your group knows this, that, hey, since we're in such small numbers, you need to represent our group appropriately. So as your numbers of your group start to decrease, you're more of a minority, the pressure of the cultural policing actually increases because now
Hmm.
more is at stake. Because if just one member is representing our group poorly,
Yep.
it affects the entire group because we're such in the minority.
Hmm.
Now, if we flip that script, once your group is in the majority, all those dynamics shift because one of the benefits of being in the majority is that now, if one person is acting abnormally or what we consider out of line, we're just going to judge that person as an individual and say, hey, oh, that's just Jamal. Jamal's different. All right. Like that's it. So we're going to judge him as an individual, assuming because this is the majority group. We can't generalize to the whole group if it's just one
Hmm.
person, if they're in the majority. It just
Hmm.
wouldn't make sense. And that's not
Hmm.
really the way our mind is wired in that way. So I saw that at the HBCU
Yeah.
that, when one person wasn't fitting a script, they were less likely to be accused of acting white and just likely to be targeted individually to be like, oh,
Hmm.
well, that's that person. They're just different. They're not really representing the group. But when you're in a dynamic, when you're in a context where your group is in the severe minority, then that's where the cultural policing is exponentially increased. And that's where we see this acting white accusation happen much more frequently. And it's actually used in a way to try to correct that person's behavior. So in other studies, we've done much more follow-up work with the perpetrators to really understand the psychology of why do you feel the need to perpetrate?
Yeah. Yeah.
And we were actually shocked with how candid some of our perpetrators were and actually saw themselves as doing the community a service. where they're
Wow.
like, yes, I perpetrate this, but I perpetrate this because this one person was representing our group inappropriately. They're like, I had to accuse them of acting white to kind of steer their behavior, pull them back into the group so that they could be socialized and have that more stronger group affinity so that they don't quote unquote sell out, and overly assimilate into the white dominant group on our campus. So that really shocked us that, they weren't, we assumed that going into that investigation that most of our perpetrators would just be doing it in a very reactionary kind of
Right.
you hurt me, I'm gonna hurt you
Yeah.
back. You insult me, I'm gonna
Yeah.
insult you back. But we actually saw some folks who, without even being insulted themselves, they were going out and accusing others of acting white, but doing it out of what they saw as a service, to the community overall.
Yeah. To protect the larger group at hand. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting. So one more question here, and then we'll get into sort of some of the basics around code switching. Do you know, or do you think that then students or folks that attend historically Black colleges and universities versus Black students that attend predominantly white institutions, do you think those students at the HBCUs, do you think attending an HBCU predicts code switching behavior in some way? And so, like, if you're in an institution where you're sort of being taught that it's safe to be yourself and do your thing and whatever, and then you get out into sort of the real world, and you're potentially working in a in an environment where it's back to you're back to being the 4% or 3%, versus the the 80% or 70%. Um, are those folks less likely to code switch, or are they more likely to sort of run into a whole lot more stress because of sort of that shock to the system? Whereas the folks who had in the PWIs, who at least had some practice early on, are going in more prepared. Do you know about anything there?
Yeah, so there's no one answer to that question, but I can
Yeah,
kind of
yeah,
walk
for
you through a
sure.
few different scenarios because it
Yeah,
gets
yeah,
really complicated.
yeah, yeah,
So, and it really that's how important context is, because
yeah.
context can change the entire nature of these insults, and these invalidations, all depending on that context. Okay. So I'll start with the HBCU context. All right. What's great about HBCUs is that it creates a scenario where for nationally, ethnic minority students are now in a school context where they're they're in the majority. And the fact that they're in the majority, they're able to see the diversity in all the other peers at the institution. So you know, we have racial diversity. The Black diaspora is very diverse as well. You have a fair amount of multiracial individuals there too. You have extreme economic diversity as well too, across all different economic, thresholds. And you have identity diversity too, and even their racial identity and their racial
Mm,
solidarity of kind of
mm.
like, quote unquote, how black are they? How black down for the cause
Yeah,
are
yeah,
folks?
yeah.
So you have all this diversity. So because of all that diversity, it's just less, necessary to have to accuse folks of acting white. Like, yes, it does come up. Don't get me wrong, it comes up.
Mm.
But when it does come up, mostly we got it is that, oh, it's just coming up as a joke. It's things
Yeah,
that we're
yeah.
all aware of, so we're doing it as a joke. You know, and in that case, even if it does come up in a situation where someone is now trying to insult you and target you, because your context now, your school context has all that diversity, you can easily find your niche of people who have a similar background as you, have the same interest as you. So there's like a place for everyone to fit,
Mm,
which it lowers the stakes of these, so we call them now culture invalidations, which acting white is just one type of a broader framework of culture invalidations where you're
okay.
discrediting someone's identity. But because you can easily find that support group and find other people who have your same interests, when these invalidations do occur, it's not going to sting as much. Okay. Now, if we switch gears to a context of you're at a predominantly white university where your group is now in the severe minority, what changes here is your same perpetrators are also your same support network. All right. Because there's just not enough
Mm,
members of your group.
right.
So if you're like trying to find that safe space and a safe space folks who are from the same cultural background as you, this is still going to be the same individuals who are now calling you out whenever you step out of line, you behave in a way, or if they just want to insult you, if they think you're getting too cocky or big headed, they know how to cut you deep. But at the same time, you still have to rely on the same individuals for your support,
Mm,
through the
mm-hmm.
system. So it really muddies the situation here. One, it makes you much more salient to these dynamics too. They're gonna sting more. I mean, and it's gonna take longer to cope with
Yeah.
because you can't as easily distance that person from you the way you can if your group's in the majority. You can be like, you know what, I'm just not gonna interact with that person. I don't have to run into them for days or weeks or months. But as your numbers decrease, all these power dynamics shift and you're much more reliant on that smaller community. And that
Right.
community is more likely to cultural police each other in general to make sure that everyone's representing that group appropriately. So it gets
Hmm.
really complicated.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, let's get a bit into code switching. maybe we could start with just sort of a bit of a definition here on what code switching is. I think this term seemed to come up a lot more sort of in the last sort of 4 or 5 years. And there's a great podcast out there called Code Switching.
There is.
And, I encourage folks to check out. That's kind of where I first heard the term. So tell me about what code switching is and how does it differ from these sort of acting white accusations?
Yeah, absolutely. So the term code switching has been around for a long time. So it was coined in the field of linguistics. So code switching originally was used to describe someone who can seamlessly switch between two different languages in a same conversation. So that would be someone who's like bilingual, who speaks both English and Spanish, and in the
Sure.
same conversation can mix between both languages just seamlessly. So that is
Yes.
code switching. Later, code switching was expanded to also include different dialects, realizing that even if you have, a native English speaker, there's many different ways to speak English depending on your dialect. So originally, that dialect addition to code switching was to identify African American vernacular English.
Right.
So this is what's called Black English, for shorter. So it was to identify with individuals who were very fluent in Black English, but also fluent in kind of the mainstream dialect of English, which some have say standard American English, or which we associate with the way that white Americans speak. Okay. So for individual who's fluent in both of these, their tone of voice, their delivery, the way they pronounce words, even the syntax of the words, it's going to shift dramatically, almost like a different language. Even though they're still speaking English, it's going to sound very differently. So that's how code switching was expanded. And we see that too play out in many people's day-to-day lives, depending on who they're interacting with, what space they're in. Even if they are speaking the same language, they're going to speak that language in a very different way, depending on that context. So to a degree, all human beings do this. All right. So the way that most people do it is their more casual version of speaking versus their more professional version of speaking.
Right.
Okay. So your pitch is going to go a little bit higher when you're more professional, your tone, things are going to change like that. But we find out that individuals who have marginalized identities, or stigmatized identities, now we see that pressure for them to have to code switch, the stakes are much higher. Particularly if you're in a position where, your phone voice carries a lot of weight. So let's say if you're in a more administrative position or a secretary and you're the first point of contact with clients. We see that a lot of companies want a certain sound for their company, and typically that sound is someone who sounds friendly, upbeat, and also sounds white.
Yeah.
So many ethnic minority individuals have learned that, to succeed in corporate America or to, interface with clients, to code switch their voice on the phone, particularly to sound in a way that either makes it harder to guess what their race is or just simply mirrors the dialects and the delivery of a white individual, given that is the majority group. So, all right, so that's code switching linguistically. So as a psychologist, code switching has expanded to other fields after linguists have kind of coined it. So as a psychologist, we also realize that, yes, style of speech is a very important way to code switch, but we realize that individuals can code switch more than just their style of speech. And in fact, when they're in person with someone, they're code switching their entire self-presentation. So that includes their behavior, that includes their mannerisms, that could also include their appearance, a certain degree of what jewelry do they select. If they have a variety of different jewelry, do I choose more ethnic jewelry that shows my culture, or do I choose more, what would say, the dominant mainstream jewelry in this context? Even your hairstyle. So switching between a more natural hairstyle that fits your cultural group or, chemically processing your hair or straightening it to fit with a more European aesthetic.
Yes.
Individuals can also code switch their ideologies or even their beliefs that they choose to express. So let's say if I believe that, Black Lives Matter, but I'm in a space that's very much more conservative, I may change the expression of my, personal beliefs in that space because I don't want to be, discriminated against or targeted or called out, So there's many different ways that individuals to code switch, but from a psychologist, as we look at this, an individual to be successful with code switching, particularly when you're in an in-person dynamic, you have to code switch all of these to fit that profile that you're looking to mirror in that case. So if I'm, let's say, interviewing for a job and it's at a Fortune 500 company that is not very racially diverse, and I'm going to code switch to the majority group in that situation, I have to code switch not only my voice, but I have to code switch my mannerisms. I'm going to code switch in the way that my attire, my dress, I might even code switch my hair selection for that day to make sure it fits as cohesively with, a more European aesthetic. And I have to make sure all of these are consistent with each other to fit with the delivery. So if I only were to code switch one of these but not the others, that might confuse the audience. Wait, okay, yeah, your voice sounds, like the dominant group, but you showed up in, a dashiki. So they're gonna be like, what's going on here? So that's where you kind of have to learn to master all these different dynamics for code switching to be successful. So for a single definition of code switching, we define it simply as adjusting one's style of speech, their behaviors, their appearance, or even their ideologies in order to mimic or mirror a specific racial group.
Mm.
So most oftenly, individuals are typically, especially ethnic minority individuals, are racially code switching to mirror mimic the dominant racial group in that space. But we know in real life experiences that as you move between different racial contexts, you can also face that pressure to have to code switch back to your own cultural group. Okay. Because let's say you grew up in a very racially diverse or predominantly white neighborhood your whole life, you may not know all the lingo, the cues, the dynamics to fit with your own cultural group. So for
Hmm.
some individuals, they may actually experience more pressure to have to code switch back to their own cultural group that they identify with.
And so, with all these folks sort of growing up in a context where they're potentially being accused of acting white for their entire childhood, where do they sort of get the time to sort of practice these skills and become good at code switching? And how does that even look? Like, code switching sometimes seems like it's something that just happens so instantly, depending on the context, and you're able to kind of switch it over. But some of the things you're saying sounds like folks really have to kind of do a lot of thought and preparation to code switch for certain contexts. And so, how do folks even sort of learn how to do that well? And is this something that's happening all the way back to childhood? What does that all look like?
Yeah, so code switching takes years of experience to master.
Hmm.
Because the only way that code switching is successful is if your audience has no idea that you're even code switching. So
Yeah.
that means you have to be able to deliver that certain self presentation in a way that your audience thinks that that is the genuine, true version of you. So
Hmm.
it has to come across as natural.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
in order for this, because it's almost like getting into character. So
Hmm.
if we're all
The second secret word is colorism.
professional actors, we have different characters throughout our daily lives. In order for that character to be perceived by others as genuine and natural, you have to have a lot of experience of switching into that role so that when you get into that delivery, at least the audience who's meeting you in that point in time, they think that that's the authentic version of you, even though they don't know you have all these other characters you can switch between. So, in order to master that, you have to have years of experience doing it. So, for a lot of individuals, their first exposure to code switching happens very young and usually happens through witnessing their parents do it without any
Mm,
explicit conversation. Because I mean, children absorb everything they see and hear,
yeah,
so they're just like
yeah.
a sponge. So for a lot of children, they just see their parents of okay, when my mom or dad gets a work call, their voice changes dramatically into a whole different person. Or if they see their parents out in public, and sometimes this comes up a lot in our data, that when they've witnessed their parents interacting with white people out in public or interacting with someone in a customer service position in order to get better quality service, whether that's at restaurants or department stores, etc., they witness their parents change their presentation, simply to be respected and to get better quality service, in that situation. So children start to notice this and they remember these patterns, even though they may not ever bring it up to their parents or let them know that they learned it, they
Hmm.
just take note of this. So when they become of age, a lot of times they just start to mirror the same behavioral patterns that they witnessed their parents demonstrate because that's the way that the parents actually socialize them, even unintentionally, not even knowing that they were training their kids how to code switch in that way. All right. So that's probably the most common way that young children start to pick up code switching dynamics
Right.
without kind of brutally being forced to have to learn it. All right. But another situation is if you live in, let's say, like an ethnic enclave, in a particular space where you're typically surrounded by people of your own cultural background for the vast majority of your day.
Hmm.
Now you're not going to be exposed to that dynamic of having to switch between different profiles or even witness other people switch between profiles. So for a lot of individuals, the very first time they feel that extreme pressure to have to code switch is when they enter college, when they move away to college. And in the US, I think last time I checked, it was about 85% of US higher education institutions are designated as predominantly white. So the
Okay.
vast majority of colleges, universities in the US are predominantly white, but the US population is much more diverse than that. So for
Right.
the majority of students, they're matriculated into predominantly white universities. And if they did grow up in ethnic conflict, now as they're immigrating and integrating into these schools, it's a cultural shock where they're like, oh wow, no one looks like me now. Like I may be in a
Hmm.
minority
Hmm.
status for the first time in a
Hmm.
school setting. So they're picking up on these cues, they're learning it in real time, but that could be really difficult because now they're in the situation where they have to kind of execute that code switching,
Hmm.
just as they're learning it. And that's where the outcomes can get really mixed and sometimes can be, even more detrimental
Hmm.
because when your audience is aware that you're code switching or they just see that you're trying to
Hmm.
fit another aesthetic, but it's not
Yeah.
coming off as natural, then they're going to perceive you and judge you much more negatively. They're going to have less
Hmm.
trust in you. They're not going to see you as
Hmm.
genuine. And they're not
Yeah.
going to want to get as close to you because they feel like you're kind of pandering towards them or that you're just not being genuine in yourself. So that's where the stakes can get a little slippery.
So if you're really good at it, then that's one thing. And if you're not, then it could cause some problems. Are there contexts where even if you're really good at it, it probably wasn't necessary, but you do it anyway?
Yes, absolutely. So it's actually a methodological issue that we're running into right now with our data collection. So
Mm-hmm.
we call them the automatic code switchers. All right.
Mm-hmm.
So these are folks who have been code switching for probably the majority of their life, or they
Right.
probably witnessed it as a young child, or even if they didn't witness it as a young child, then they've been in situations for like over a decade where they've been doing it. So any behavior that you engage in for long enough, it becomes like muscle memory, where
Mm-hmm.
your mind is so plastic and adaptive, where once it kind of learns these behavioral patterns and it learns, hey, as soon as you get to work and you open that door, you always switch into the same profile. If you do that for enough years, your mind already learns how to switch into that different character, that different profile automatically, and it starts to take it outside of your conscious awareness. Where if you do it long enough, you're no longer even aware that, oh yeah, when I get to work, I'm a completely different person. I sound different, I behave different, I act different. I even have different interests, and I like hockey all of a
Mm-hmm.
sudden at work. So it's just your mind starts to automate those processes. So for these automatic code switchers who've been doing it for so long, it gets harder for them to tell when they're code switching and when they're not code switching, because now it almost becomes another dimension of their personality. So our personalities can also have several different dimensions. We have several different types of our personalities depending on what spaces we're in. And now that code switching profile, if it's well seasoned and it's been polished and finessed, it now becomes a new dimension of their personality where as soon as there's any social cue that can trigger that, and sometimes these cues happen unconsciously where they're not aware of it, they can switch into that different personality dimension almost at the drop of a dime. And
Mm.
they may not see it, but other people around them see it and they're like, oh, whoa, especially if there's someone who knows them across different contexts.
Yeah,
They can
yeah.
always pick up on these shifts much more easier than the automatic code switchers are. So the reason we ran into a methodological issue in our research is that our early research all relied on self-report data.
Mm.
So we asked people about these dynamics. We asked them, how much pressure do you experience after code switch? How often do you code switch? How taxing is it all you to have to code switch?
Mm-hmm.
But for our automatic code switchers, and they're the ones who do this the most, where they can't even turn it off, we can't ask them for self-report because they can't give us an honest response. So when we ask them these same questions, typically they tell us like, oh, yeah, I guess I code switch sometimes, but not a
Mm.
whole lot. When in
Wow.
reality, they're constantly code switching.
Wow.
It's just they're no
Yeah.
longer aware that their mind does it. So that's why we realized the only way to get that group is that we have to bring them into a controlled lab setting for a lab experiment. We have to introduce subtle cues into that environment, and then we have to videotape them to see, can they pick up on these cues and does their behavior change in real time? And then after that, we have to get a self-report from them to ask them, hey, by the way, did your behavior change at all in that previous situation? And our automatic code switcher is going to say, no, my behavior didn't change that much, but we have the video footage of them switching it to a whole different person.
So what are kind of some of the effects that code switching can have on people that are doing it?
Yeah, so code switching, it can be taxing. It can be extremely taxing because at least initially, it's a very heavy cognitive load
Yeah.
to have to almost learn a new racial personality. Okay. And so my lab, we look at code switching, we look at racial code switching primarily, but I want to point out that code switching happens across every social identity. So individuals can code switch across their socioeconomic status. I can code switch to appear like I'm from a wealthier social group than I actually am. Individuals code switch across their sexuality to avoid being targeted in that way. So
Mm.
they can kind of
Mm.
mask aspects about themselves or present themselves as much more masculine or feminine in certain contexts
Mm-hmm.
to fit those social scripts. Individuals code switch across their religious identity, their political identity. So across all these identities, there's situations where people can, tone it up or tone it down to try to fit into different spaces. So when we look at code switching, racially code switching specifically, we find that typically from the experience of ethnic minority individuals, they oftentimes perceive it as a stressor, definitely immediately, because they feel that they're pressured and they have to code switch simply to be respected or to avoid being experiencing additional bias and stereotyping. So they find that if they don't change their style of voice to basically accommodate the dominant group to mirror and sound more like the dominant group, then that can be a basis for them to be ignored for different educational opportunities, ignored for different hiring positions or opportunities, employment opportunities, or even promotions, because it's so easy for the dominant group to say, hey, that person's not a good fit. They don't really
Mm.
fit in with, our aesthetic, our
Mm-hmm.
norm, or
Mm-hmm.
kind of our our company culture. They don't really fit with that company culture. So these all set stakes where that's where code switching can be beneficial, both educationally, professionally, economically. So individuals have learned these dynamics, and that's why it kind of forced their hand to have to learn how to code switch in these situations. And with that said, I want to be sure to point out that not everyone code switches, okay?
Mm-hmm.
So we have a group of folks too who are aware of these stakes. They're well aware that if they did code switch, it might lead to even additional education or economic or employment opportunities, but they intentionally decide to not code switch, where they
Mm.
refuse to change their behavior in order to accommodate the dominant group. Or in their case, they often say, I'm not going to sell out simply to get a job, you know? So we
Mm-hmm.
do have individuals who do push back, and that's totally fine. I mean, no one should be forced to have to change your own personality in order to get a great education or to get a good job. In terms of your question about what are the consequences of this,
Yeah.
we find that code switching it's a stressor. It's associated definitely with a higher level of employee burnout. Because you can imagine for someone who has a very demanding job in general, to have to do that same job under a different personality that fits a different racial group, that's just
Mm.
another level of cognitive load. They have to do a
Mm.
very demanding job. And we're talking about oftentimes white collar, very professional
Yes.
corporate jobs in this way. But even someone who's, works at a customer secretary position where you're on the phone all day,
Mm-hmm.
these are still situations where you have to code switch and manage your job at the same time of code switching. So it leads to burnout, it leads to lower job satisfaction. And also we're finding data amongst university faculty that it also predicts a lower likelihood of retention. The individuals who have to code switch more frequently already think about leaving that position. But in terms of some of the benefits, we find that individuals who do code switch perceive that oftentimes report that that led to them getting that position in the first place. It leads
Mm.
to they report more positive evaluations from their supervisors, and also they report from both themselves and from others perceive them as more professional.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's a lot of problems with that. What are some things? Because I think if anyone who's kind of listening to this is probably not only wanting to know more about it, but wanting to know how they can maybe help folks not feel the need to do this. And so, what are some things employers can do to sort of help folks feel like they don't need to sort of engage in this mentally taxing behavior every day?
Yeah, so there's not one panacea of one size fits all. It's kind of like a
Yeah, yeah,
combination of things.
sure.
I will say for most companies and most organizations, if the code switching has happened effectively from your employees already, the leaders in the organization are going to have no idea that the code switching is even happening. Because, like I said, those individuals are doing it so well that the supervisors and leaders of the organization they assume that they're just being natural and authentic, and they just happen to fit
Mm,
with the aesthetic of the existing
yes.
dominant group in the
Yeah,
corporation.
yeah.
So, really, the only way for leaders and supervisors to understand if code switching is a problem is to administer regular anonymous climate evaluation. So this can be annually, this can be every few years, and you have to make sure that it's anonymous because you have to get honest data. And basically just to ask the members that you work with and your employees, do you feel the need to have to change who you are simply to do your job or to be respected or treated fairly? So
Mm,
even just very simple questions. And I
mm,
think many supervisors will be surprised in the fact that, even their employees who they thought loved their position and, or love coming to work, they may not know the pressure that they feel to have to put on that performance,
mm,
at work. So that's the first step is to understand how severe is this a problem in this organization. And I would say that's the easier step is to identify the problem. The harder step is to now truly create an inclusive space where people feel comfortable bringing their authentic self to work without the fear of any potential consequences or being pigeonholed or being reprimanded for bringing their authentic self to work. Um, so one of the common tactics that have been used in corporate America is diversity trainings. All right. So, as we know, the research and the data on diversity trainings is so problematic because to truly have a cultural change in an organization, you cannot have a one time, 1 hour diversity
right.
training to teach people to be less prejudiced and less biased and educating them on implicit bias, which was,
Hmm.
that was, positioned to be the fix all. If people are just aware of their implicit biases, they'll
Mm,
naturally be motivated to want to change them. But
yeah,
we found out
yeah.
that that latter part was not the case. When you educate people that they have implicit biases, they're like, okay, interesting. All right. So either they just move on, or sometimes it makes people very defensive where they're like,
Mm,
I do not have that implicit bias. Sometimes they can even double down further. So they're going to have some negative consequences, with that. So in order really to create a workplace environment that is more inclusive, I mean, you're going to need a critical mass of diversity in the first place. Like I have to
mm,
admit, if your workplace is so homogenous where you only have
right.
token members of each group, no matter what you do, it's going to be very difficult to convince those individuals where it's safe to bring their authentic self because there's not even a critical mass of individuals from their identity or from multicultural
Mm,
identities. It doesn't have to be just
mm-hmm,
their identity, but there's just not enough diversity in the first place, even to
mm,
feel that sense of a multicultural aesthetic, you know? So that's going to be a critical step is making sure that there's at least a critical mass of diversity in the first place. You're also going to need that diversity across the corporate ladder, where it can't be we've only diversified our entry level positions, the people who have
right.
no power, the least power to have any influence on any policy. That's not going to do it. So you're going to need some diversity in leadership as well, the folks who have the authority to start to have implement policy changes. So little things such as if we look at the professional standards of a lot of companies, I mean, traditionally they had things such as saying like no piercings are allowed, no tattoos are allowed, no beards are allowed. I
Mm,
mean, these are things that just, let's be honest, they're not going to fit with millennials and Gen Z a lot of the
yeah,
times.
yeah, yeah.
So sometimes these, what we consider, you know, traditional professional standards, we have to adjust these to accommodate a much more diverse and a more multicultural workforce. All right. The next thing to do is to, like I said, too, with those professional standards, you have to evaluate those professional standards because all the time these don't get updated for decades. All right. So you have to go back to those to see, are there any aspects of these professional standards that might be unintentionally ostracizing or discriminating
Mm,
against certain
mm,
individuals, such as if you have like, you know, hair requirements where, you know, for ladies, your hair has to be straightened. Not every ethnic group has straight hair naturally, you know? So things like this can already start to create these bias standards, which
mm,
perpetuate that pressure to have to code switch.
mm. And maybe it's not beyond this, beyond sort of just historical racism. Why would employers have these kinds of requirements? I can maybe understand, for maybe some of the older generation, struggling with, full facial tattoos for certain roles and whatnot. But even then, I think, we can see that these folks are clearly capable of doing jobs just as well as the folks with other tattoos. But why do sort of things like straight hair? Why are things like straight hair required at jobs?
Yeah, so we could think back to, you know, for especially, you know, much older organizations that have been around for a long time. Many of these professional standards were written a long time ago. So they were written in an era where there was only one dominant group in that entire
Right,
workforce. So it fit those times where they're like, okay,
right,
we're writing these for one specific group. All right. These are kind of, this is the look that we want our employees to have, especially if you're the face of the company. This is how we want to position the company at this time. All right. So many of those rules are still on the books and they just haven't been updated given that our workforce looks very different
right.
in 2025.
That's just
So
the
some of these
photo in the
common,
old ad or whatever. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
So some of
yeah.
these rules that kind of common across companies say things such as no head coverings,
Mm,
assuming that you don't want your employee wearing like a baseball cap. But what if
right.
you have an employee who's Muslim and wears a hijab? That is a head
Yes.
covering.
Yeah, yeah,
So at the
yeah.
time they wrote these, they were assuming don't come with a baseball cap, you know, a cowboy hat, something like that, but not really considering how now that can be culturally exclusive in
Mm.
current times.
Thinking about your Muslim example, what does code switching look like with groups where either it's things like head coverings that they're wearing sort of all the time as part of a kind of a cultural norm, or where their English, where they still have a strong accent from their language, so they can't really switch to sort of, the white English because they just have never been exposed to that, and so they're always going to have, maybe a strong accent or something like that. Are these folks still able to engage in code switching in some way?
Yeah, I mean, these individuals definitely engage in code
Hmm.
switching. You know, I mean, code switching by itself is a universal. So every
Hmm.
human being is capable of engaging in
Right.
code switching. We only see these differences in the frequency depending on the social dynamics. So that's where,
Hmm.
like, you know, systems of social class, you know,
Yeah, yeah,
race
yeah.
hierarchies start to play in these power dynamics that pressure certain groups to have to racially code switch more just to be accepted. But at its pure level, like every individual is going to code switch to some degree. So yeah, so these individuals definitely going to code switch. So, but the longer time you spend in a particular context, you're going to start to absorb those new norms. So let's say if I recently just immigrated to the United States, but I was already fluent in English my entire life, but I spoke
Hmm.
with a very different dialect, you know, as soon as I get to the US, yes, I'm going to have a strong accent. Okay. But if it's a strong priority of mine to code switch from the get go, then the longer time I spend here, I'm going to start to pick up these nuances and it's going to start to become a little bit easier. And I say this like I'm not encouraging that. This is not like an encouraged approach. Like, yes, the longer you're here, the more like us you become. The more normal you
Mm-hmm.
become. No, like I'm
Mm-hmm.
not saying
Mm-hmm.
that. I'm just saying it's a natural human dynamic. Of the longer time you spend in any space, the more you just start to pick up these social attributes and these social cues.
What's some of the projects you're kind of working on right now?
Yes. So right now we have several projects going on. So we were still looking at cultural invalidations, including the acting white accusation. We've now been looking at longitudinal projects. So following
Mm,
college students over many years, starting from college entry all the way to college graduation, to see how do these experiences fluctuate over time, and what are the implications of these invalidations longitudinally? How does it impact their mental health? How does it impact their,
mm-hmm.
identity development over time?
Mm-hmm.
So that's on the cultural validation side. On the code switching side, we've now launched that into several different segments too. So we've looked at code switching in the professional workplace context amongst Black professionals specifically, to
Mm,
understand how they understand and implement code switching dynamics. We did a major evaluation of university faculty at University of Michigan. So
mm,
we got several thousand faculty to
mm.
get at how they code switch. And we measured faculty across all racial groups and backgrounds, our entire faculty. We had about 3,000 survey completions of our
Wow.
faculty. So nearly half of our faculty completed our assessment on code switching. And those results were shocking. So I'll jump into that just a little bit. So as
Yeah,
you would
yeah.
expect, faculty from ethnic minority backgrounds code switch significantly more than our white faculty did. So at U of M, white faculty make up, I believe it's about 73% of our university faculty. So in the vast majority. So faculty of color definitely code switch more frequently. But the single group that racially code switched more than anyone else was Black women faculty. They by far had the highest rates. As a racial group, it was African American Black faculty overall compared to other groups, but really Black women faced the greatest pressure to have to code switch. Now, for a small subset of our white faculty, we reported that they also reported racially code switching. And we
Mm,
were like, huh, that's pretty interesting. Given that your group is in the vast majority, what does this code switching look like for these
mm-hmm.
individuals? So we found that when we dove into the data for the white faculty who reported racially code switching, the two most common items that they reported code switching on, the first matched with every other racial group, and it was changing your style of speech because of your race in order to fit in at work. Okay. So that
Mm,
was across every racial group. But what was unique for the white faculty, the second most common factor of code switching was changing the expression of their political beliefs because of their race at
mm,
work in order to be successful. All right.
mm,
So for the other racial groups, that political expression of your beliefs didn't really jump off as much, but for the white faculty, it did. All right. So then we looked at what are the predictors that are leading to this dynamic to have to racially code switch. And we found that for white faculty, particularly who had a very different trend from all other faculty, if they were in a academic department where they perceived their own department to be more racially equitable, and
mm,
racial equity simply just means that you perceive that all faculty are treated fairly, equitable, regardless of their race.
mm,
That actually exacerbated their racial code switching. So it
hmm.
worsened their racial code switching, which they
Interesting.
found stressful. And that stress from the racial code switching lowered their job satisfaction and lowered their likelihood to stay at the university over the next 2 years.
Hmm.
So we found it interesting. We're like, huh, okay. So seeing your department is more racially equitable, that's a good thing. We would want that. But it's stressing out, and once again, it's not all white faculty. It's a small proportion of them, but the effects were really strong for this group. So really, it's the pressure to have to performatively support DEI
Mm,
because racial equity is a component of DEI. So
I
the inner
see.
department where they perceive that, yes, the faculty are treated equally in my department, but it's pushing me to have to racially code switch. And what they're code
Wow.
switching is that expression of their political beliefs. They can't say the way they truly feel about DEI in this department, at least at that
Gosh.
time. Things have changed dramatically now that U of M has banned DEI, but we collected the data right before DEI was banned. If we were to recollect this data, I'm sure we would get probably very different reports now. They may not feel as pressure to have to mask, their either performatively, supporting DEI or just, suppressing their opposition to DEI. It could be one of those others. But I'm sure we would get probably different response now that the climate has changed at the university. But interestingly, though, for all faculty of color, we found the exact opposite trend, where the single most protective factor to lower their racial code switching at work is that racial equity in their department. So for faculty of color, if they perceived it more equitably racially in their department, their code switching declined significantly. And then that in turn improved their job satisfaction and their likelihood of wanting to stay at the university. So we were seeing polarizing effects here.
And so did the university sort of administration at all respond to any of this data? Or, like how did that sort of affect things?
So we delivered the report to the university. So they were aware of it, but there was no official response. I'll say
Mm.
that. But this is also taking place in the background where the university was considering, abolishing DEI in the first place. So
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
yeah.
Yeah, so not much has changed. So just keeping that in mind, I mean, I'm in Canada, and so we're not seeing as many blockages to sort of research right now. And I think we're pretty comfortable with our most recent election that things will be fairly safe for a few years.
Fingers crossed.
Yeah, fingers crossed. Being that most of your research is kind of in that realm, how have sort of these legal changes affected your job and the work you're doing, and what kind of research are you doing now that sort of still allows you to be funded and not fined?
Yeah, so fortunately, we collected a lot of data before these dramatic shifts in, our federal administration
Mm,
and policy changes.
mm,
So my lab is fortunate. We have a lot of data where we continue to publish off of for the next few years.
got it.
Because we were just in a push over the previous few years of just to collect all the data we possibly can. So I have a few more projects I didn't tell you about, but we have the data on it and we'll be working through that. So
Yeah,
we'll
yeah.
still continue to clean and publish with that data. But yeah, it has definitely changed the environment,
Mm,
prior to this current even internally at University of Michigan, when we collected that massive data university faculty, U of M
mm,
funded that project. So it was
mm.
funded internally. But I
Yeah,
imagine under our current shift in, core values of the university, it would probably be difficult to have that same project funded internally, given the shifts in values currently. So yeah, so it is gonna, for future research, it is gonna create a dilemma. And it basically forces us to have to package the way that we describe the work differently, where we have to frame it more as a universal for everyone.
right.
Yeah. So as we know, I mean, racial code switching, which is the work I do, we do see that, yes, on average, it is much more stressful for ethnic minority individuals to have to code switch. There's very few situations where individuals from the dominant group have to code switch, because, and if they do racially code switch, typically it's voluntary. It's, I choose to change in this way, but if I didn't, there's very little consequences. The stakes are kind of minimal there. And that could be a different scenario for an individual who's from a underrepresented group. So now in the way that we're positioning the studies, we have to describe code switching more as a universal, that look, everyone engages in code switching, which is true.
Right,
Everyone
right.
does,
Yeah, yeah.
but it's more of exploratory to understand, okay, what are some of the precursors to why individuals engage in the code switching? So we just have to kind of package the work in a different way that appeals to the masses and doesn't position the work as only being relevant for
Mm.
a specific ethnic minority group.
You'll have to sort of continue to sort of include the dominant group as participants in those studies.
Yes.
Yeah,
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 you got
yeah.
my gist there. Yep.
Yeah, 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 yeah. Interesting. So it's interesting to sort of understand sort of the origins of the term that comes from linguistics, that sort of everybody does it. Something because it seemed to be sort of in the code switching really was a term that was only to be applied in sort of the black and white kind of context. And the reason I say that is, so I work a lot in sort of the autism sort of space with neurodivergent folks. And one term that comes up a lot these days with folks who identify as neurodivergent is this concept of masking,
Hmm.
and sort of trying to be essentially more come off as more neurotypical than neurodivergent, which again is that a thing? Not necessarily. Sort of, I think in a lot of ways it does go back to sort of the dominant white group setting these norms and sort of some of these other pieces. Is masking and code switching essentially the same thing, or are we talking about sort of two different entities? And is that just a myth in my mind, or is it problematic to call that code switching?
No, no, no. They're very related. They're very related. I would say, yeah, like kind of like sisters. But the one
Yeah.
distinction I will point out is that, yes, masking in itself is code switching because you're
Mm,
presenting yourself in a different way that is not your default way that you would normally present yourself in that space. So typically it's kind of concealing a certain identity that you possess, but you still have to present yourself in a way that appeals to the
mm-hmm,
dominant group in that
mm-hmm,
space in order to
mm,
conceal the identity that you do possess. So that itself is code switching. But with masking, only certain individuals or certain identities can be masked. Okay.
mm,
Because in order to mask, it has to be a social identity that can easily be concealed. So
mm,
in this case, that's where racial code switching wouldn't really fit within masking,
I
but
see.
masking is still a type of code switching. But
Right.
let's say for your kind of, for some individuals, your sexual orientation, sometimes that can be a social identity where you could be a strong, proud member of a sexual minority group. But if you don't have a phenotype that no one can really gauge your sexual orientation based on your phenotype, then you're in a position where, yes, you are able to mask that identity as you move between different spaces. And you can code switch and present yourself in a way that can allow you to blend in with the dominant group in certain spaces. So whether that's at work or with certain groups of friends or sometimes even with family, you can
Hmm.
blend in with that dominant identity, but then in other spaces, you can reveal or engage in more your natural behaviors and aesthetics.
Hmm. Interesting. On a related note, there's been a lot of conversation more recently about around intersectionality, and sort of the idea that really there isn't just one identity that we're talking about here. And so, has there been research to kind of look at sort of those stressors and how that differs? So, say how does say the you know someone who's black but still members of other dominant identities, and what code switching kind of looks like for them versus someone who might be black and neurodivergent and part of the LGBTQ community and so on, and kind of what that all looks like.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. It ups the stakes for code
Right.
switching and makes
Yeah.
that code switching even more challenging because now you
Yeah.
have to appeal to multiple groups at the same time
Mm-hmm.
or to try to suppress. If I mean, in the case of masking, then you have to try to suppress, these multiple
Mm-hmm.
identities simultaneously. So it definitely complicates it, but it speaks to the real lived experience. And I think it's definitely that intersectionality. Why? I mean, across several studies, when it comes to racial code switching specifically, we are seeing that Black women, especially Black women professionals, are reporting the highest rates kind of across the board. But I
Yes.
think it's that combination of that intersectionality where not only are they having to code switch, their race, but also with that combination of their gender, their race is policed in a different way compared to, let's say, a Black male professional. If he
Right.
slips up in the code switching and says, "Yo, what's up, homie?" Then he can come across to work as like the cool Black guy at work. But if a Black woman were to slip up accidentally out of that code switching, then she may not be perceived in that same positive way as, the cool Black
Yes.
woman employee. So
Yeah.
because of
Yeah.
that, her racial identity is probably going to be much more penalized in that case compared to a Black
Of
man
course.
wouldn't really receive that same kind of blowback or that same reaction. So it really kind of it complicates the situation there because of that particular intersection of identities. And if that Black woman happens to be a queer Black woman, now we just added another layer to where there might be another level of code switching and masking taking place there as well to avoid being further targeted or stereotyped or pigeonholed in that way by others.
Curious what you're seeing. I have a lot of behavior analysts that listen, um, and they often talk about a lot of the experiences they have at conferences.
Hmm.
They kind of work conferences, and again, those conferences tend to be dominated by the white folks, and they tend to be in the minority. And I've had a lot of conversations where Black folks are like, "I'm the only one at this conference," or "I see the other guy," and we see each other across the room and hang out and discover that I didn't even know you were in the field. And this is something that's developed more, and we now have a couple of Black organizations now within the field that have their own conferences, and we start to see some opportunities for folks to kind of get together. I'm curious about sort of in your own personal experience, what sort of code switching behavior looks like just for Black psychologists in the psychology field, and sort of the acceptability of being a Black psychologist in the psychology field. I know I had a fellow Dr. Evan August on a while back, and he's a Haitian American researcher that's does a lot of work around, I think, sort of Haitian Americans and whatnot, but also um, um, published a nice paper kind of on the history of Black psychology, and so I brought him on to kind of get that whole story and sort of kind of everything from the Martin Luther King and '69, and then the sort of separation, the creation of the Black Psych Association and so on. I'm just curious what your experiences have been and what your colleagues' experiences have been sort of with code switching and sort of and that sort of thing in the psychology field.
Yeah, so I'm glad you brought up the conference scenario because
Mm,
conferences are a very unique context for code
mm.
switching.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
the reason it's unique because, okay, so Professional conferences, pretty much, I imagine this dynamic applies to any industry, regardless of you are, but your professional conferences, particularly if you've been in that industry for a long time,
Yeah.
you're going to have some colleagues or friends that you've known for many years. But at the same time, you're also meeting new professional colleagues or potential collaborators or clients or partners. So you still have to present yourself in a professional way, and to appeal to that professional aesthetic that, many of us are probably familiar with code switching too. But at the same time, you might have a colleague that you've known for a decade come up to you and approach you. You're going to switch out of character briefly to greet that
Mm,
person at the
mm,
same time that you might be interacting with a new person or new,
yeah.
say, potential mentor or, a client that you just met you want to impress. So it creates this interesting situation where you're switching between different, versions of yourself very
Mhm.
quickly, in order to appeal
Mhm.
to different audiences. Because let's
Mhm.
say like one of my lab mates when I first started grad school, if I saw them at a conference and gave them my, kind of work voice,
Yeah,
I'll be honest, like the way I'm speaking right now, so my kind of professional, aesthetic,
sure.
they will kind of look at me funny, like, all right, Miles, you can turn it off now.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
So, but when the fact that you have individuals from different entities of your life, or in your of your day-to-day identities and the same context, it kind of creates a very unique situation of having to switch between different versions of yourself even within the same space. Another scenario that we ran into in our data collection that we didn't plan it but it was great for the data was we were collecting data and then COVID hit. So when COVID hit, everyone was in quarantine, but we were still conducting surveys and interviews. So when everything was shut down, we were quarantined. For a lot of families and a lot of parents as well, particularly, it was the first time where they had to work side by side on Zoom with their kids. So for
Mm.
a lot of Black parents specifically, it was the first time their kids actually saw their parents switch into an entirely different person right in the household as soon as the Zoom call
Mhm.
started.
Yes.
So now it forced a lot of Black parents specifically to have these intentional conversations with their kids. And it wasn't the parents driving these conversations, it was their kids saying, who was that person on that Zoom call? So then the parents, a lot of times, weren't even aware that they code switched so severely, but now they hear their kids calling them out, and making nicknames for their work voice, and then now they have to come to have this conversation about their kids about why they do that. And their kids are like, why are you faking, at work? You're not that person. And the parents have to justify why they switch into this different role at work specifically. And then it created another challenge too, because some parents had a parent at the same time they're on Zoom calls, but knowing that they don't, they talk to their children, in a very different dynamic cultural aesthetic, they have to negotiate too of, okay, my colleagues are watching me. How do I communicate this message to my child who I see in the corner of my eyes doing something they shouldn't do? So they're also having to negotiate this code switching in real time to determine which version, do I present the fact that I'm being watched by two
Mm.
very different audiences who get two very different versions of myself.
Yeah, yeah. What's even been like your own kind of personal experience? I mean, you're a switching researcher,
hmm
you know, often in sort of predominantly white sort of environments. Probably code switching yourself, on occasion. Are your white colleagues going, is this Miles? Is this somebody else? And are they? And do you find that sort of folks, like myself, are even acting differently or nervously around you? Kind of wondering, what are you doing? Like, are you pulling one on me? Like that sort of thing.
So I do get that question from my colleagues, and I think it's hilarious. Yeah. So I have to admit, like at this point, so I was one of those children that, from my youngest age,
Mm,
my parents never had a code switching conversation with me, but I just saw how extreme their code switching was. So I'll
yeah.
give you an example. All right. I was in the kindergarten. I was in kindergarten. I got in trouble at school. And you get in trouble, you get sent to the principal's office and they call
Yep.
your parents at work.
Yeah.
So they said, dial your mom. We need to talk to your mom. You're acting up. All right. So I'm in
Yeah.
kindergarten, like, oh, I'm in trouble. All right. So I dial my mom's direct work line. All right. So when it rings, a white woman picks up the phone and I'm like, hey, can I speak to my mom? And then the same woman switches up and says, hey, baby, what you need?
Oh
And I'm like, oh, mom, that was you? She's like, yeah, that's my work voice. What do you need?
my gosh.
And I was like, oh. So that situation shows I couldn't even recognize my own mother, who I heard her
Wow.
voice every single day. I didn't know that was her on the phone because I had never heard her work voice
Yeah.
before. And her work voice was a completely different racial group, a completely different person. And she knew that intentionally, but she had perfected that voice over so many years that it
Yeah,
just switched
yeah.
on automatically, and she switched out automatically too as soon as she heard my voice. Like,
Wow,
so,
amazing.
but that's just show how extreme the code switching can be. So
Mm,
that was my childhood, just witnessing this. My dad did the same thing. He had his own
yeah,
company, real estate company. So he had a different voice at work. So just seeing that that was kind of modeled for me as a kid. I kind of just, without having a direct conversation, just absorbed it. So now as an adult, I mean, I never thought I'd be studying code switching for a
yeah,
living. So that kind
yeah,
of came about just coincidentally.
yeah.
But I have to say that for now, like, I don't notice when my code switching happens unless it's an extreme iteration of that code switching. So I'll give you an example of one extreme iteration. When I was at University of Chicago, I worked pretty late in the evenings at work. So I was leaving our office, our academic building, at about like 9:30 at night, and it was already dark. So I thought I was the only person in the building. So as I'm exiting, one of our very senior faculty members is also leaving that late, and I was shocked. So I didn't want to startle her, you know. As I'm
Mm,
approaching behind her, I went to say hello or excuse me, just to announce myself.
yeah.
And the octave in my voice had went up so high just to say hello that my voice broke. It cracked. And I was like, hello. And then that's when I noticed I was like, holy crap, I'm coach like,
Yeah,
you know, increasing the tone of my voice so high just to come across is less scary, in
right,
that
right.
situation as a black man.
Yeah,
So then, of course, the fact that it was brought to my attention, like, oh, I coached this way too hard. Of course, the natural reaction, I try to overcompensate right after. So I was like, hello, how's it going, man? Hope you have a good night. But at least now it's not typically, I mean, these days, I only notice the like extreme versions of the
yeah,
code switching because I've been doing it for, decades where it just kind of happens automatically.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And what about sort of though the behavior, of, your white colleagues that know you kind of do this work? Do you find that they're, sort of acting nervously around you, or just in general, folks that are aware of sort of code switching behavior? Do they? I mean, I ask this because I know that I used to do this when I kind of first started learning about this. I say to a lot of folks, I before I started doing this podcast, I think I had like 3 conversations with black folks in my entire life, just based on the context and environments that I lived in, and none of them were about anything serious. And so, as I started to get to know more and more folks, and I think I've interviewed I think more than 60% of my guests have been black, and I've been able to really you know get a lot of individual perspectives and individual conversations. But I often wondered, who am I interviewing?
Hmm.
And what am I hearing? And even for those folks that I know feel, and this kind of thought that kind of came up today when I was talking to you, even for those folks that I know, tell me they trust me and have, articulated, we feel safe around you, Ben. We don't, we're good. But they also know that my listeners all probably are mostly white folks, potentially, because our field is predominantly white. And are they then feel like they're speaking to the listeners and not to me, on those sorts of things? And so I wonder about it from time. I don't put too much energy into thinking about it, but it just kind of came as a thought more today. And so just curious about sort of the behavior of the folks you're code switching with.
Yeah. So I'll be honest, like, professors are very comfortable in their jobs.
Yeah.
They're definitely a unique group. So I would say my colleagues don't necessarily, feel, I don't know. I don't think they act any different way around me.
Mm.
I mean, one question that I do get, and that is kind of it's the question I hate the most, is when people say, hey, can you code switch for me right now? Like on
Mm.
the drop of a dime, turn it on.
Wow.
And even for someone who's very capable of code switching, the reason why that's hard is
Mm.
because the fact that your mind has already ingrained it into a muscle memory, you almost need a
Mm-hmm.
social cue to
Yeah.
trigger that. So when
Yeah.
someone
Yeah.
asks you
Yeah.
to intentionally do it, even if you have
Mm-hmm.
years of doing it, it gets kind of hard to do that because you're like,
Yeah.
if I try to do it right now, it's like me in a bad way, performatively trying to do
Mm-hmm.
this.
Mm-hmm.
But if someone switches context or they're, in a different situation where those cues switch to
Yeah.
match, then they can switch into that character
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
automatically. So that's where the psychology behind it kind of complicates and makes it difficult for people to, at the drop of a dime, change their accent. I mean, now we're just mostly talking about impersonations. If people
Sure.
are good at being
Yeah.
an impersonator,
Exactly.
they can do that. But it's
Yeah.
different from like a seasoned code switcher. Like you kind of have to
Yeah.
have those social cues to
Yeah.
trigger it because your mind is kind of taken out of your conscious awareness when you do switch into that profile. The other question I get too is and it's a question coming out of a place of well-intentioned, but we have to
Mm-hmm.
definitely caution advice against it, is that members of the dominant group, particularly in academia, who learn about code switching and understand that, yes, individuals from minoritized backgrounds, regardless of what that identity is, feel greater pressure to code switch. Then I see sometimes the question or natural intention is, oh, well, maybe I should code switch towards their group to
Mm,
make them feel more comfortable around me. And the reason we highly discourage against that is because if you don't already have a strong cultural understanding of that group and a strong cultural competence, then when you, out of good intentions, try to code switch towards that group, what you're doing is code switching towards the stereotypes and almost like a caricature of that group because you don't really know the nuances of how to deliver it in a way that feels natural. All right.
mm,
And then the reason why that's different for minoritized individuals is because for the vast majority of their life from birth, they're
mm,
already being socialized of the norms, the cues, the nuances of the dominant group. So when it comes time to have to learn and have to engage in those behaviors, they have already years of experience of understanding these
mm.
subtle little social cues to
Yeah,
make
yeah,
that delivery come across as more natural. So when someone of the dominant group tries to code switch toward the minority group and hasn't put in that work of years of just that cultural familiarity, it just comes across as performative. It comes across as pandering. Oftentimes, it comes across as offensive. Of please don't do that, and it can actually harm those relationships. The rather that person just never tried and just remained themselves. So I have to give that caveat. That's why code switching is so difficult because in order to do it effectively, you have to deliver it in a way that feels natural to your audience. It comes
yeah.
across as you being genuine.
It doesn't seem like something that's going to go away anytime soon.
It is not. As long as we have different cultural differences, which is a good thing. I mean, I
Yeah.
think code switching in and of itself, all right, if we lived in a perfect world, we would still have code switching.
Mm,
But what would be different about that situation is that all the code switching would be purely voluntary, where you're still going to have individuals where it's just already part of their personality. So in personality psychology, it's a trait called self-monitoring. So this is an established, well-studied personality trait. It was
mm,
coined in the 1950s and has
mm,
been studied ever since. So every human being is going to fall somewhere on this distribution of self-monitoring. And what self-monitoring means is that these individuals are constantly monitoring their context and their surrounding, and they're judging, am I fitting the social cues? Am I doing the right things, behaving in a way, following the rules? So some individuals are very high self-monitors, where regardless of what space they're in, they're constantly reading the room, seeing how other people are behaving, and they're adapting accordingly to make sure that they don't violate any social norms. Okay. So, in a perfect world where all groups were on the same equal status, we would still have code switching because you
mhm.
would naturally have people who, as soon as they're around a different cultural group, they're going to change their presentation to try to be amongst and immersed in that group. So, they're going to hear the way that people pronounce things. Like, even I was in Jamaica last summer, instead of things, I say tings. So, you just start to pick up on it. So, it's like, oh, I'm going to get some tings. Like, you just
Yeah.
start to, without even knowing it, you're just absorbing these different like dialects and different cues. So, some people are naturally going to do that. But the reason why we still frame code switching as a stressor in current today's standards is because it's not an equal playing field. Given the power hierarchy that we have in all cultures across the world, and even the fact of a racial hierarchy and other types of, social status hierarchies, we have certain groups that face much more pressure to have to code switch simply to
Mm,
be deemed as acceptable of fair treatment and service
mhm.
because they're mirroring those norms of the dominant group. And that
Yeah.
allows them to get greater inclusion to spaces to advance their educational goals, professional goals, or just life goals. So because of that, that's why we frame code switching currently now as a stressor a lot of times, even though, but if we were to remove that level of hierarchy, then code switching, it was purely voluntary for everyone, the way that it currently only is for the dominant group when they do code switches, oftentimes just purely voluntary, then that would make it less of a kind of problematic dynamic.
Yeah. I mean, and certainly in those kind of college and professional settings, that makes a lot of sense. It's also, I suppose, a safety skill for a lot of folks because code switching is probably also really necessary for. We have a lot of. We talk a lot about in kind of behavior analysis around early intervention. This seems to be where a lot of our research focuses, and there's been a lot of conversations recently around sort of kind of how we do our work with Black families, and sort of looking at sort of functional skills that you want to kind of teach early on to kids so that it can kind of prep them for adulthood. And one conversation that I've had quite a bit on this show is around because autistic, there are a lot of kids on the autism spectrum, autistic kids that struggle with just social interactions in general, right? And can engage in sort of can be sort of overstimulated by the environment, engage in behaviors that can really maybe throw people off potentially. And if you're dealing with a situation, in particular with police,
Hmm.
there's a much higher risk of sort of a individual who hasn't sort of learned social skills to sort of engage in a behavior that could not only get them into trouble but could get them killed.
Hmm.
And so code switching in sort of that context becomes a real safety skill in order,
Hmm.
not just for autistic folks, but for, I think for any Black individual that gets pulled over by a police officer. I'm curious about sort of what work has been done around sort of early learning and young kids to sort of prepare them for a life where they're going to have to engage in these kinds of behaviors and potentially mitigate some of those stressors as they get older, because they're going to have to do this for the rest of their lives. And what kinds of conversations have there been there? The third secret word is identity.
Yeah. So, okay. I have two different answers, but I'm going to
Yeah,
start with the first point. So, yeah.
yeah,
So, when you described that earlier of encounters with law enforcement, yes,
yeah.
sometimes these can definitely be life or death situations. And I mean, we've seen in our data and other reports too that the ability to code switch effectively can help to alleviate the sense of anxiety or
Mm.
sometimes even fear, which is ironic, that an officer may have, but the officer is the one with a firearm, that can
Yeah,
make that situation lethal very quickly or escalate that situation with aggression and violence very quickly. Almost the code switching is used in that way to accommodate their comfort. All right. So typically the individual is code switching a way to alleviate the anxiety from the law enforcement agent
of
to kind of
course.
show to them,
Yeah,
hey, I
yeah,
am
yeah.
I am not a threat. All right. So it's almost trying to disarm the law enforcement by code switching.
Yeah.
Using very formal language, using sir, yes, ma'am, yes,
Mm-hmm.
please, thank you, in a way to make them more comfortable and less on edge. So
Right.
in that case, it is a survival tactic.
Yes.
It's a way. And even going back in history in the United States, particularly even with slavery, code switching was used in slavery to appease, slave owners, in order to receive better treatment for them as well, too. So kind of we
Mm,
see this continuation to avoid of using code switching as a survival tactic to
yeah.
avoid violence, harm, and
Yeah.
potentially death. So we see that happen. But with that said, we still are in the position where we don't want to encourage folks. If you don't feel comfortable code switching naturally, we don't want to have to force you to have to code switch. So yes, for some individuals, this is used as a survival tactic. It's used as a tool in their toolkit. Okay. But we kind of frame it as a toolkit. You have many tools in your toolkit. Okay. So code switching is just one of those tools in your toolkit to help you get to a desired outcome or goal. Okay. And this tool, it's not a one size fits all. I mean, this
Mm,
code switching, it can work for some individuals very
yeah.
well, but for other individuals, maybe they're just not good at code switching. So if you're just not good at it or you just don't want to do it, you, let's say, personally decide not to do it, we don't want to force you to have to do that because the outcomes aren't going to be any better. Because once again, the only way you get those positive outcomes is when it comes across as genuine and authentic. And if you don't want to do it in the first place or you're not good at it, you're not even going to get those positive outcomes because your audience is going to see you as pandering to them. And they're going to know that you're not being yourself and they're not going to
Yeah.
give you that
Yeah.
positive outcome. And in many situations, you actually get a worse outcome because they don't see you as an honest person in that
Mm,
case.
mm,
So we definitely have to emphasize that we do not encourage code switch for everyone. It's a personal decision, but for
mm,
those who do decide to make this decision, they should be aware of the cost and the benefits associated with it.
mm-hmm.
So to get at your latter question, which was remind me of the question, it was a developmental question.
Well, just more about like what does sort of early intervention, early learning look like? Even, this might even be not necessarily in the context of schools, but sort of, advice for parents, or, just around sort of kind of the best ways to sort of teach your kids about code switching. You say a lot of it's about, it's just modeling. We just see our parents doing it and we start doing it ourselves. But, do we need to be having kind of more conversations with kids around what this is all about and what this means and sort of help them sort of, ease the burden, as they get older to potentially have it not be as stressful all the time, even though they still have to do it.
Yeah, okay, great question. Yeah, so I get this question from parents of
Mm,
"Hey, like, should I be training my child to code switch? Will this prepare them for a more successful life in the future?" And That there's not a simple answer to that question. I have to start off there. It's not always just a yes or no, okay?
Yeah.
But I would say it's important to start to have these conversations, all right? And I think why that conversation is important because the amount of middle-aged and even older adults that I encounter who are like, "Hey, I've been doing this for all my life and I never knew there was a term to describe it. I
Mm,
just thought it was just me just trying to avoid racism." And I think like I thought it was just a personal thing that I was doing, and I maybe heard of a few other people doing it, but
yeah.
I just thought that it was me trying to avoid a worse outcome. I didn't know
Yeah.
there's like a construct and a whole body of research around it to
Mm,
understand why people do it, the motivators,
mm,
differences between some people do it better than other people and the individual difference. But so it's important to have that conversation. So parents can have that with their kids, especially if the parents are already code switching themselves. I think it's very powerful for the parents to communicate with their children. If the parents made an intentional decision to code switch, then why did you make that decision? You know, and I think that's a great conversation to have with your kids of this is why I made the decision to code switch, but I don't want to force you to have to make that same decision. If you choose to follow in the same pathway I chose, that's great. But if you choose, you know what? I'm going to keep it 100. I'm just going to be myself in all contexts. On that note, we are seeing a generational difference where
mm,
Gen Z, their priority is being authentic and genuine to
yeah.
themselves. So we're
Yeah.
seeing a lot less motivation to code switch amongst Gen Z. So with that said, there's definitely some caveats of as they get older, you know, and get that first mortgage and, you know, car payments and everything, you want to scale that corporate ladder, then, you know, that priority of keeping it a buck and 100, that might change as they
Mm,
see
mm,
potential outlets of trying to scale that corporate ladder. But at least in the, you know, in their young 20s and teenage years, you know, for them, their top priority is to be authentic and to be genuine to themselves. So amongst them, we're seeing a lot less pressure, not less pressure, but a lot less significance placed on needing to have to code switch. Where for
mm,
them, we're seeing the more common response we're seeing, especially when it comes to the workplace, is they would rather switch jobs than to
mm.
code switch in order to fit into the existing company culture at their current job. They're
Yeah,
like, you know what?
yeah.
I have no loyalty to this position. I'm just going to find another workplace that can accept my piercings, you know, my tattoos and everything, accept me the way I am. So we are seeing a shift there. I guess only time will tell if that is actually a generational shift and if that continues, because we do see developmentally over different age spans that as individuals, we have some really great data over from 18 to 80-year-olds that shows that right as individuals get around their mid 30s to 40s, that's really where we're seeing a peak in code switching. But
Hmm.
it makes sense where a lot of times it's where individuals are family planning. Now they're likely, you know, have a mortgage or looking to buy a house. Expenses are increasing, and they're really thinking about building, you know, financial security. And in a lot of ways, if they're in already a professional or any occupation of wanting to, you know, get that promotion, you know, or become, you know, get that promotion to become a supervisor or to scale that corporate ladder. So these are situations where now their perception of code switching may shift, or they may see it as much more of a necessity to gain that respect, or to unfortunately be perceived as more professional, you know, by their supervisors in order to gain that upward mobility.
Well, I guess there's some hope in maybe some of these folks from Gen Z eventually being the ones running the show in some of these companies and potentially setting up environments where maybe the need to code switch is lessened.
Exactly. I mean, that is really the goal. Yes. I mean, every company culture can be changed. I mean, they don't change quickly. It takes time, but with intentional effort and strategic policy changes, company cultures can shift. It becomes a matter of fact of does the company want to shift their culture, you know, or do they like it the way that it is? You know, and you know, before there was this backlash to DEI, we saw so many companies putting a diversity statement on their website.
Yep.
Okay. And in that case, it was just very performative, where, you know, the wording in that statement looked nothing like what the day to day was for many organizations and companies. Where if you read that statement, it's a safe space, we're
Mm-hmm.
very inclusive, bring
Yep.
your authentic self to work. But then on the day to day, people were still nervous and cautious of, I don't really trust this company enough to bring my authentic self to work. So that's where, you know, unfortunately nowadays, most companies have now taken down those diversity statements. But now it really becomes a call to action of, you know, if it really was a value to be more inclusive, now rather than just a, you know, superficial statement on the website, what actions are you taking?
Mm.
Are you actually, you know, surveying, checking in with folks, you know, to understand is this already an inclusive space, or is it only inclusive for certain folks who have the power in that organization and they feel very comfortable, and that hinting there's less motivation to want to change that
Mm-hmm.
company culture.
Yeah, and unfortunately, it's probably just going to come down to the dollar, and will an inclusive, equitable culture, lead to more profits?
Yeah, I mean, but there's good data that shows. I mean, we see Delta as the number one airline in the country, double
Mm.
down on DEI. Costco
Mm.
as well, double down on DEI, and they're outperforming all their competitors.
Mm.
So it goes
Mm.
to show you that diversity and inclusivity is profitable
Mm.
and it is successful, when it's
Mm.
implemented well.
Mm.
But when it's implemented in a very superficial way, we'll say the way that Target did it, where people were like, oh, it's kind of, and then reneged on it very quickly. You
Yeah.
can see it backfire on you very quickly. So yeah, so it doesn't come as a trade-off. You don't have to, sacrifice, your standards, your
Yeah.
quality, your profitability for diversity and inclusivity. You'd actually have both, but it takes strategic planning. You need to bring in folks or even consultants who do this work to help you with your planning so
Yeah.
that even if you have a campaign or advertisement, that it doesn't get perceived as just superficial, problematic, or
Mm.
stereotypical,
Yeah. I mean, when it comes right down to it, I mean, the global majority is not the white folks. And so the global market is diversity. There just seems to be still this push for a lot of these cultural groups to want to be more like that white group. And so
Yeah.
if we can
And if
lessen
you want
that,
the top talent running your company,
yeah,
that top talent has many different colors,
yeah,
different genders,
yeah,
different, political beliefs.
yeah. Yeah, Myles, this has been a fascinating conversation. I've really enjoyed learning all about code switching and learning about the work you're doing, and it's been really cool hearing from you.
Thanks so much, man. I really enjoyed the conversation. It was a pleasure to be here with you today.
Yeah, hope to have you back sometime.
Sounds great.
Right on. I think these episodes of Behavior Speak really complement today's conversation. Episode 224, Colorism in Context with Dr. Danielle Judy. Episode 170, A Smiling Racism, Reflections on Racism in Canada with Danny Reed, Juliette Massange, and Michelle Upshaw. Episode 115, Microaggressions, a Primer with Dr. Bria Banks. And finally, episode 98, Black Liberation Psychology, a conversation with Dr. Evan August. You can find us on Instagram and TikTok and subscribe to our YouTube page at Behavior Speak. And if you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify.